The Shadow Agent. The marble floors of Grandview Heights condominium gleamed under the afternoon sun streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows. Detective Marcus Sullivan adjusted his badge as he approached the elegant lobby, responding to what dispatch had described as a suspicious person complaint. The caller, Mrs. Patricia Whitmore from Unit 27A, had insisted that a black woman was casing the building, acting suspiciously near the mailboxes. Sullivan had heard these calls before. Usually they amounted to nothing more than residents' prejudices masquerading as public safety concerns. But protocol was protocol, and he had to investigate every report, no matter how dubious it seemed. As he entered the lobby, he spotted her immediately. A woman in her mid-30s stood near the elevator bank, dressed in a simple black blazer and dark jeans, her natural hair pulled back in a neat bun. She was checking her phone, occasionally glancing at the directory board. To Sullivan's eyes, she looked like any other resident or visitor. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step over here," Sullivan called out, his hand instinctively moving to his radio. The woman looked up, her dark eyes meeting his with a calm that seemed almost unnatural. "Is there a problem, officer?" Her voice was steady, professional, carrying just the faintest hint of something Sullivan couldn't quite place. Authority, perhaps, or warning. "I've received reports of suspicious activity in this building. I need to see some identification." Sullivan moved closer, noting how the woman's posture remained relaxed, almost casual. Most people showed signs of nervousness when approached by police. This woman seemed completely unfazed. She reached slowly into her blazer pocket, movements deliberate and visible. Of course. Her fingers produced a leather wallet, which she opened and extended toward him. "Here's my ID." Sullivan glanced at the driver's license. Diana Richardson, age 34, with an address that matched one of the penthouse units in this very building. He frowned, looking between the ID and the woman. Something didn't add up in his mind, though he couldn't articulate what. "You live here?" he asked, suspicion still coloring his voice. "Unit 42B. I moved in 3 weeks ago." Diana's response was matter-of-fact, patient. She seemed accustomed to this line of questioning. "And what were you doing down here that seemed suspicious to other residents?" Diana tilted her head slightly, a gesture that somehow managed to convey both understanding and disappointment. "I was waiting for a package delivery and checking to see if the building manager was available. I'm still unfamiliar with the building's protocols." Sullivan studied her face, searching for signs of deception. His training told him to trust his instincts, but his instincts were clouded by something else, something he didn't want to acknowledge. This woman, standing in this upscale building, claiming to live in a unit that probably cost more than his annual salary. It didn't fit the narrative he'd constructed in his mind. "I'm going to need you to prove you live here. Do you have your key?" Diana's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. "Officer, I've provided identification that clearly shows my address matches this building." "I'm curious about the specific complaint you received. What exactly did the caller describe as suspicious behavior?" Sullivan felt his jaw tighten. He wasn't used to citizens questioning his investigations, especially not with such calm confidence. "Ma'am, I ask the questions here. Please show me your key, or I'll need you to come with me for further questioning." The lobby seemed to grow quieter, the usual sounds of the city muffled by thick glass and marble. Diana reached into her other pocket, producing a sleek electronic key fob. She held it up but didn't hand it over. "Before I demonstrate access to my own home, I'd like to understand the nature of this complaint. As a law-abiding citizen, I believe I have that right." Sullivan's hand moved to his handcuffs. "Ma'am, you're being uncooperative. I'm going to need you to turn around and place your hands behind your back." "On what charges?" "Trespassing, until we can verify your story." Diana's composure finally showed the first crack, not of fear, but of something far more dangerous. A cold smile played at the corners of her mouth. "Officer Sullivan, I strongly advise you to reconsider this course of action." Sullivan froze. "How do you know my name?" "I know many things, Detective. Badge number 4793, 15 years with the department, 2 commendations, one formal complaint for excessive force that was dismissed due to insufficient evidence. Married to Sarah, father of twin boys age 7, drives a 2018 blue Ford Explorer license plate number Delta Kilo 7892. The color drained from Sullivan's face. "Who are you?" Instead of answering, Diana reached into her blazer once more, this time producing a black leather credential case. She flipped it open with practiced ease, revealing a gold badge and identification card that made Sullivan's blood run cold. "Special Agent Diana Richardson, Federal Bureau of Investigation. I'm the Assistant Director of the Organized Crime Task Force, currently investigating a money laundering operation that involves several high-profile individuals in this city." Sullivan stared at the credentials, his mind reeling. The FBI seal gleamed under the lobby's lights, undeniably authentic. The photograph matched the woman standing before him, and the authority in her voice suddenly made perfect sense. I didn't know." "Of course you didn't know." That was rather the point. Diana closed her credentials and returned them to her jacket. "I've been conducting surveillance on certain residents of this building for the past 3 weeks. My presence here is part of an ongoing federal investigation." Sullivan felt sick. "Agent Richardson, I apologize. I was just responding to a complaint. A complaint about a black woman acting suspiciously near mailboxes." Diana's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath. "Tell me, Detective Sullivan, when was the last time you responded with handcuffs ready to a report of a suspicious white person in an upscale building?" The question hung in the air like a physical weight. Sullivan's mouth opened and closed, but no words came. Diana continued, her voice never rising above conversational level, which somehow made her words more impactful. "I've spent the last 8 years building cases that have resulted in the conviction of over 200 federal criminals. Drug lords, human traffickers, corrupt politicians, organized crime bosses, men who've killed for less than the inconvenience you just caused me." She took a step closer to Sullivan, who instinctively stepped back. "I've gone undercover in situations where a single mistake meant death. I've testified before Congress, briefed 3 different attorney generals, and personally apprehended fugitives that the FBI had been hunting for decades. Last month, I led the task force that dismantled the largest money laundering operation in this state's history, seizing over $50 million in assets." Sullivan's radio crackled to life, but he ignored it, transfixed by the woman before him. "But today, I was detained in my own building's lobby because someone decided that a black woman checking her mail was inherently suspicious." Diana's smile was sharp as a blade. "Do you understand the irony, Detective?" "Agent Richardson, The individual you were called to investigate? The suspicious person? I'm currently tracking 3 suspects in this building who are connected to a federal case involving tax evasion, money laundering, and connections to organized crime. One of them is likely the same person who called in this complaint." Sullivan felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. "What do you mean?" "Mrs. Patricia Whitmore, Unit 27A. Her husband, David Whitmore, is a person of interest in our investigation. We have evidence suggesting he's been moving money through offshore accounts connected to a gambling syndicate with ties to 3 different crime families." Diana pulled out her phone and scrolled through several official-looking documents. "We've been monitoring electronic communications, financial transactions, and yes, monitoring the comings and goings of residents in this building. Mrs. Whitmore's complaint about me was likely an attempt to have me removed before I could gather additional evidence." Sullivan stared at the documents Diana showed him, official FBI letterhead and legal seals visible even from a distance. She was trying to interfere with a federal investigation? Unwittingly, perhaps, but yes. By responding to her complaint and attempting to detain me, you nearly compromised a case that's taken 18 months to build and involves criminal activity across 4 states. The detective felt sweat forming on his forehead, despite the building's air conditioning. "I had no way of knowing. You had no way of knowing because you made assumptions based on racial profiling rather than facts." Diana's voice remained professionally calm, but her words cut deep. "You saw a black woman in an upscale building and immediately assumed she didn't belong, despite the fact that I provided valid identification proving my residence here. Sullivan opened his mouth to protest, but Diana held up her hand. Let me be clear about something, Detective. I'm not interested in destroying your career over this incident. We're on the same side, law enforcement. But this situation represents exactly the kind of systemic problem that makes my job, and the FBI's job, more difficult.
She gestured around the opulent lobby. When citizens can weaponize police responses based on racial bias, it compromises legitimate investigations. When officers respond to those calls without questioning the underlying assumptions, it creates chaos that criminals can exploit. Sullivan nodded slowly, beginning to understand the larger implications. Mrs. Whitmore's call wasn't just racially motivated harassment. It was potentially obstruction of justice. Her husband, who we've been investigating, likely encouraged her to make that call when they noticed increased activity around their unit. Diana's phone buzzed, and she glanced at it briefly. In fact, I just received confirmation that David Whitmore attempted to transfer a significant sum of money to an overseas account approximately 20 minutes ago, right around the time his wife called in her complaint about me. Sullivan felt a chill run down his spine. He was using the complaint as a distraction? Criminals aren't stupid, Detective. They understand how to manipulate systems, including law enforcement response. By having his wife call in a suspicious person report, David Whitmore created a window where he assumed federal surveillance would be disrupted. Diana showed Sullivan another document on her phone. Fortunately, we have multiple agents on this case. While you were responding to deal with me, my partner was monitoring the Whitmore's financial activity. We now have evidence of an attempted wire transfer that directly connects David Whitmore to our money laundering case. The lobby doors opened, and two individuals in dark suits entered. Sullivan recognized the bearing of federal agents immediately. "Agent Richardson," one of them called out. "We have David Whitmore in custody." The transfer was intercepted, and we found additional evidence in his unit. Diana nodded to her colleagues, then turned back to Sullivan. "Detective, I want you to understand something important. This case, which will likely result in the indictment of over a dozen individuals and the seizure of millions in illegal assets, nearly fell apart because of a racially motivated complaint and an officer who didn't question those motivations." Sullivan felt the weight of her words. "What happens now?" "Now, you have a choice. You can file a report that honestly describes what happened here today, including your initial assumptions and how they affected your response. You can use this experience to examine how racial bias impacts your work and potentially compromises public safety." Diana stepped closer, her voice dropping to a more personal tone. "Or you can dismiss this as an unfortunate misunderstanding and continue operating the same way, which means you'll likely find yourself in a similar situation again, possibly with more serious consequences." The detective looked around the lobby, seeing it differently now. The marble and glass that had seemed to confirm his assumptions about who belonged and who didn't now felt like a stage where he'd nearly compromised a major federal investigation. "Agent Richardson, I want to learn from this. I want to do better." Then start by asking yourself this question. How many times have you responded to complaints about suspicious people of color in spaces where white people felt they didn't belong? And how many of those complaints were legitimate security concerns versus expressions of racial bias? Sullivan thought about the dozens of similar calls he'd responded to over his 15-year career. The pattern was clear once he looked for it. "Too many," he admitted. "Recognition is the first step. The second step is understanding that this isn't just about hurt feelings or political correctness. When law enforcement becomes a tool for racial harassment, it undermines legitimate public safety efforts and creates opportunities for actual criminals to operate." One of Diana's colleagues approached. "Agent Richardson, we need you upstairs. Whitmore is asking for a lawyer, but his wife is cooperating. She's providing information about other residents who might be involved." Diana nodded, then looked back at Sullivan. "Detective, I need you to understand that everything I've told you about this investigation is confidential. However, I also need you to include in your report that your response to the suspicious person complaint inadvertently aided in the apprehension of a federal fugitive. Sullivan blinked in surprise. It did? By detaining me in the lobby, you prevented David Whitmore from seeing me return to my unit, which would have alerted him to federal presence in the building. Your actions, while problematic in their motivation, actually helped us complete this operation successfully. Diana's expression softened slightly. Sometimes good outcomes can emerge from problematic situations, but that doesn't excuse the underlying issues. Use this experience to become a better officer, Detective Sullivan. As the FBI agents moved toward the elevators, Diana turned back one final time. And Detective? The next time someone calls to report a suspicious person, ask yourself what specifically makes their behavior suspicious beyond their race or their presence in a space where the caller thinks they don't belong. Sullivan watched the elevator doors close, his mind reeling from everything that had transpired. He looked down at his notepad, where he'd intended to write a simple report about investigating a trespassing complaint. Instead, he'd witnessed the conclusion of a major federal investigation and been forced to confront his own biases in ways that made him deeply uncomfortable. His radio crackled again. Unit 79, what's your status on the suspicious person call? Sullivan lifted the radio to his mouth, hesitating for a moment. Dispatch, the suspicious person complaint was unfounded. The individual was a resident of the building. However, the call did result in assistance with an unrelated federal investigation. I'll need to file a detailed report. Copy that. 7-9. As Sullivan walked back toward his patrol car, he thought about Agent Diana Richardson's words. She hadn't just been the target of racial profiling. She'd been one of the FBI's most effective agents, someone who'd dedicated her career to fighting crime and protecting public safety. His assumptions hadn't just been wrong, they'd been dangerously counterproductive. The marble lobby of Grandview Heights had seemed like such a clear-cut environment when he'd first entered. Expensive, exclusive, a place where certain types of people belonged and others didn't. But Agent Richardson's presence there had shattered those assumptions completely. She belonged there not just because she could afford the rent, but because her work, tracking criminals, building cases, protecting society from organized crime, was exactly the kind of work that should be valued and respected. Instead, she'd been treated as a threat, simply because of her race. Sullivan thought about his twin boys, 7 years old, and what he wanted to teach them about justice and fairness. He thought about the communities he'd sworn to protect and serve, and how his biases might have prevented him from serving all of them equally. Agent Richardson had given him a choice: learn and grow from this experience, or continue operating in ways that could compromise public safety and perpetuate injustice. The choice seemed obvious, but Sullivan knew that real change would require ongoing effort and self-examination. As he drove away from Grandview Heights, Sullivan made a decision. He would write an honest report about what had happened, including his own assumptions and mistakes. He would use this experience to examine other cases where his biases might have affected his judgment. And he would remember that the next time he responded to a complaint about a suspicious person, the most dangerous assumption he could make was that he already knew who belonged and who didn't. Agent Diana Richardson had taught him that the most effective law enforcement officers were those who questioned their assumptions, examined their biases, and remained open to the possibility that things weren't always what they seemed. In a world where criminals like David Whitmore could manipulate racial prejudices to interfere with investigations, officers who perpetuated those prejudices weren't just failing their communities, they were helping criminals escape justice. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the city as Detective Sullivan drove back to the station, carrying with him a lesson that would change how he approached his job for the rest of his career. Sometimes the most impactful education came from the most unexpected teachers, and Agent Richardson had been exactly the teacher he needed, even if he hadn't realized it at the time.